Hi again. I just had a request there that might change the order a little bit. Particularly, I had thought of doing it myself anyway before we started, so I might just take a little bit of time now to look at the assignment. It's an independent topic anyway, and it's also independent of the principles we're going to be discussing shortly. Audio still seems to be okay. Good. So you've got two assignments. The balance of these assignments isn't exactly identical. So there might be a slightly larger weighting on the second one. That hopefully might be good for some of you. You're easing into discipline and you're improving your skills all the time. It won't be dramatically different, but we're looking at a slightly different weighting. We'll talk to you more about that later on. Let's talk about the specification of assignment 2, as well as a little bit on assignment 1. This is the series of labs you've already been through. We've introduced Eclipse and Java. You've motored into learning about classes, building a simple command line interface. We've explored the serialization system in Java, which is a large framework for serializing and saving objects to and from disk. And of course, we spent quite a bit of time on testing, evolving test cases, running tests within the IDE, refactoring, and relying on tests to assume that the refactoring didn't destabilize our application. We could continue to progress the application at a good clip. And of course, we've then stepped slightly outside of that to look at build systems with Maven. The idea that the IDE isn't the driver really in modern build systems. It's command line tools that can be automated. And Maven is a classic tool in that realm, much copied by other languages and systems over the years. This was the grading spectrum for your work, and as I was saying, we're really pleased with how far all of you got. Some of you are coming from slightly different backgrounds, and the kind of ingenuity and the work ethic was really, really outstanding. So great job, and you've all got your results at this stage, I think, and we look forward to you pressing on with the next round. And this is the next round. The labs will continue to support the kind of things you'll be doing in your second assignment. In fact, today's lab, Lab 08, is building the skeleton for assignment 2. When you do this lab, when you're finished this lab, you'll be ready with, I guess, the first foot in the door of the assignment 2 implementation. And you can build on that then in subsequent labs. Stuff going on here, you'll see things like REST, and you'll see things like testing REST services, and you'll also see some new languages being mentioned here. Kotlin gives you a hint here of where we might be going with some of the later material. Again, each lab is addressing an aspect of what we're asking you to explore. So we're looking across 4 kind of dimensions really. It's the same application again, so we're not changing the domain. It's still this notion of exercise-based data, activities, locations, different types of activities, searching and sorting of those. But we're adding some other features to it. We're also removing some things. Particularly, we're going to remove date and time. Not because they're not important, but because many of you had a good crack at it. You can see how difficult it can be and challenging, and I think we've maybe learned our lesson for the moment. And we're going to leave those out and focus on other aspects. So what I'm going to do here now for about 20 minutes is go through each of these aspects. The commands we want, some of the test-driven development we've been already discussing, new aspects of build and deployment we'd like to consider, and finally language features that we'll be asking you to consider and obviously will be rewarding. Let's start with the commands and the features, and they are familiar to you. We're giving you some of the same commands again, in fact, but we're adjusting it just a little, and that adjustment will require some rethinking as to how the implementation has gone so far. And of course, we'll be kicking you off on that with the skeleton lab today. So it's still a command line application. You still have the notion of users, and you can find out who the users are. A new command we didn't have in the first version is this one, which is log in a user. So we have the notion that you somehow connect, and once you connect or you're in a session, all subsequent commands, once you've logged in, refer to the user who's just logged in. So if you've ever done any web application development, you can relate that back to it, the notion of a session that can be established. Another new command we didn't implement last time is logout, of course, which terminates the notion of a session. And then the activities now change slightly. They refer to the current user. We're adding an activity for the current user, or we're listing that user's activities. So you can see this is a slight adjustment to how we're thinking, but you can see how I think it kind of makes logical sense. More though, adding location. It's kind of similar enough to what we had. List activity locations. Again, that slight twist on what we were doing. An activity report. List all activities for logged in user sorted by type. So these three commands here are largely comparable to what you did already. But again, we have to bear in mind the logged in user. And then these ones here are all new, really. Follow another user. So we now have the notion that there are many users, maybe many users concurrently on the system, and we are following one or more of them. They're our friends, if you like. Once we're following them, we can list them out, and we can see what they're up to. Friend activity report. We can build on that with more interesting things, a more sophisticated type of activity report, the ability to unfollow a friend, and then the notion that we could somehow message our friends here. Send a message and maybe see what messages have been sent to us. And there's more interesting reports here then, a leaderboard of some kind. Because we're now in a semi-social environment, we might be trying to encourage some sort of competition. And again, a slightly more extended activity report this time is for a specific friend. Finally, distance leaderboard, messaging all friends, and location leaderboard. Tried to give you in concise text here as our take on what these features are. If there's any ambiguity in that, we can discuss it on the chat room, or we might just revisit some of these slides as the weeks go on. So don't get too worried about all the details just yet. That's just the commands though, and there are other dimensions to what we're asking you to look at. We're looking at test-driven development practices. And here we're looking at you paying a bit more closer attention to coverage this time. In particular, we're looking at, for you to gain certain grade thresholds, certain test coverage statistics, which we'll be measuring. 30, 40, 50, 65, 80. We would regard 80 as the maximum you could reasonably attempt. Build and deployment is also becoming a little more interesting. An Eclipse project is how we started 8 weeks ago, 10 weeks ago now nearly. We'd like to see you considering putting that project on Git for submission. And we would like you then to consider using Maven, of course. These first three here, we've kind of covered the groundwork already. And of course, then these last two are new. And here we're taking a little bit of a step outside of our core technology to date. We'll be looking at taking the application and turning it into something that can exist on the net and expose an API across a network. We'll be introducing this technology to you as we go. And of course, then ultimately being able to deploy that on a real cloud service. Dan just asked there, should correct and bicep be used to get a better score? Yes, I think you'll see that in the coverage. Correct and bicep, these guidelines are ways of pushing the coverage higher ultimately, because they're asking you to explore different possible routes through an application. So yes, I would see you incorporating those, and if you choose to call them out in your tests via comments, then I think that's good too. Language features, another dimension. You've seen in the sample solution, hopefully at this point, that we've been using lambdas quite a lot, particularly in the reports area and also in the tests. So we'd like to see you, and we would be rewarding you using those in this time around now, particularly that you've got some hopefully reasonable role models and examples that we've worked through. Now to go to the really upper echelon, we're going to be covering Kotlin introductory level, and we will be doing some work, particularly on the lab you're doing today, and what it might look like in Kotlin. And it's possible that you could take on a Kotlin type version of one or more aspects of the application for really high grades. If Kotlin is not your thing, and it may not be, particularly if your work environment doesn't really value it or consider it to be critical, then you could look at streams, which again I think Siobhan has explored with you, or we might be doing a little bit more work on that. This is the kind of grading range we're looking at then for all these. We've got a starter grade here, which is a bit below really what it would take to pass. And I'll tell you why, because a lot of what you do in starter we'll be giving you in the labs, particularly today's lab, just to get you started. Baseline, then you can see the test coverage and the packaging deployment, and also the commands that you would be tackling to get to that level. This suite of commands here, you could probably kick into that reasonably early. I don't think there's anything more we need to do for you to have a crack at that, really. Moving up the chain, more commands for good, and the leaderboard messaging, broadcast, and other aspects on excellent. Again, I continue along the same train. However, there's a big jump here in terms of the build. We're looking at you taking the application to become a networked application and to reveal an API. We're also considering that you might look at streams or Kotlin in that range. Outstanding then means you've taken the application out of your machine, it's on a cloud, anybody can get at it. That is, we have published the API and it's available to be consumed by applications on any computer anywhere connected to the net. We've also put in, I guess this is really stretching it now and you may not have time to consider this, some sort of admin account, which we've underspecified deliberately, give you a chance to have fun with that. I would consider Kotlin still to be optional, even though I've put it in here. You could get an outstanding grade continuing to work with Java, no problem. So perhaps I should put Java and Kotlin here, but we'd like to see a fairly innovative use of some of the newer Java features if you're down at the outstanding realm. As I was saying, the labs are trying to get you up and running with this. We've already done a Maven lab, so you could use that lab again to tackle getting into the excellent range, which is the good and excellent range, sorry, which is Mavenizing the assignment. And other labs, just getting my slides here, my screen. You've already, of course, have a sample solution. That sample solution give you some guidance on overall project structure. gives you an idea on the responsibilities of different classes. At least something to think about, and we'll be discussing responsibilities again in a few moments. And in general, you won't be using this sample solution as the basis, but it gives you an idea, particularly in terms of code formatting and overall project structure, that we're interested in you following. Lab 8 is today's lab, and it in fact implements these commands here, the baseline commands. So it gets you started and up and running. Next week, we'll be taking this week's lab and exposing the features as an API accessible using REST principles. Now, we will be introducing REST, what it means, and the lab itself will give you the basics of turning the skeleton commands into a networked accessible service. Lab 10 is looking at testing a REST service. So we're moving now into, we've deployed our API and we want to stimulate it and write tests, this time that aren't necessarily living in the same address space as the app, but are probing the API we've exposed. Some new libraries and some new thinking we've got to get incorporated here. Lab 11 and 12 then step into the Kotlin world. I think Java is very influential, very powerful language, very sophisticated ecosystem. It's not going anywhere really, and the evolution of Java looks pretty secure. However, there are a range of successor languages we've discussed, I think, in the past that are making some inroads. Kotlin, particularly on Android. Obviously, you've heard of Swift, which is quite similar in many ways to Java. The language Go you may have heard of, and of course the massive growth of JavaScript itself in recent years, all of which have borrowed heavily from Java and which Java itself continues to borrow from. So that's the briefing for the assignment. Siobhan will probably talk to you a bit about it again next week. Again, you could remember the assignment really is, it's all about where you do the learning, and it's where you're applying a lot of the principles that we're covering in class. You have an indication here of how you could devote your effort. Not everybody's going to have a crack at outstanding. Maybe it mightn't even be wise, but you can see where you're rewarded and where your thresholds can arise. The core, of course, is the command implementation that requires a good understanding of the collections you've already used, and you may have to expand your exploration of some of those collections to get the right kind of implementation that makes sense and is coherent. Okay, I'll take a little bit longer break now in case anybody has questions, because you probably do on this. So I'll take a 10-minute break, but I'll be attending here during the break, and we'll be back then to cover our final topics when I return. So let's just take 10 minutes this time.